The Freeway Phantom, 1971 to 1972, USA. 6 young girls, all black, all taken from the streets of Washington, D.C., all found dead along the same stretch of highway. And the man who did it was never caught. It was the kind of case that made an entire city afraid to let their daughters walk to the corner store. The kind of case that haunted detectives for decades. The kind of case that, more than 50 years later, remains officially unsolved. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom, Washington, D.C., 1971. The city was already bleeding. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. Political scandal was brewing in the shadows, and in the neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River, a different kind of terror was taking root. These were tight-knit black communities, working-class families doing their best in a city that rarely paid them much attention. And that invisibility, some would later argue, was exactly what allowed a predator to operate for over a year without the nation truly flinching. It began on April 25, 1971. 13-year-old Carol Spinks left her home in southeast D.C. to buy groceries for her family at a 7-Eleven just 7 blocks away. It was early evening. The kind of errand a kid does 100 times without a second thought. She never came home. 6 days later, her body was found along Interstate 295, the highway cutting through the eastern edge of the city. She had been strangled, she had been sexually assaulted, and whoever left her there had done so with chilling calm, simply placing her body roadside as if discarding something no longer useful. The city grieved. The police investigated, and for a few months there was silence. Then summer arrived, and so did he again. July 8, 1971. Dahlia Johnson, 16 years old, vanished. She was found 10 days later, less than a mile from where Carol Spinks had been discovered. Same highway, same method. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Investigators began to whisper the word no one wanted to say out loud: serial. But Washington in 1971 was not a city quick to mobilize its full resources for black girls from Southeast. The neighborhoods mourned loudly. The headlines, by broader national standards, stayed quiet. He gave them no time to recover. On July 12th, just 4 days after Dahlia Johnson disappeared, and before her body had even been found, 10-year-old Brenda Crockett was taken. She was the youngest so far. At some point after her abduction, something extraordinary and deeply disturbing happened. Brenda managed to call her home. Her grandmother answered. On the other end of the line, a little girl's voice told her grandmother that a white man had picked her up, that she was somewhere in Virginia, and that he was sending her home in a cab. She sounded afraid. She sounded like she was reading from a script, her words careful and strange, coached. It was the last time anyone who loved her heard her voice. Her body was found the next day along Route 1, just outside the city. She was 10 years old. The phone call would haunt investigators for years. What kind of man allows a child to call her family, knowing she will never make it home? What message was he sending? Was it cruelty dressed up as mercy, a performance of control, or was something even darker at work? A mind so methodical it factored in the grief of others as part of the ritual. September 5, 1971. Nenemoshia Yates, 12 years old, was last seen boarding a bus. She was found 2 days later, along the same interstate corridor that had already claimed 3 lives. The Freeway Phantom, as he was now being called by the press, had a geography. He owned that highway. He seemed to know every shadow and access road along its length. October 1st, 1971. Brenda Denise Woodard, 18 years old, was abducted. When her body was recovered, investigators found something that made seasoned homicide detectives go cold. A note, written on the bag she had been carrying, in what appeared to be her own handwriting, were words that seemed dictated to her, forced from her hand before she died. The note taunted police. It identified the writer as the Freeway Phantom, confirmed he was responsible, and seemed almost to celebrate the fact that he would not be caught. Forensic analysts determined Brenda had likely been forced to write it. Her final act on this earth was being made to compose her killer's calling card. The city erupted. The note changed everything and nothing. It confirmed a single killer. It confirmed he was organized, deliberate, and deeply arrogant. It confirmed he wanted to be known, not caught, but known. And it confirmed that these murders were not random explosions of violence. They were planned. He selected, he hunted, he controlled. And then he wrote his own mythology in the handwriting of his victim. Investigations intensified. The FBI was brought in alongside D.C. Metropolitan Police tips flooded in. Suspects were questioned, including members of a group called the Green Vega Rapists, a criminal network responsible for a series of sexual assaults in the area whose methods bore some similarity to the Phantom's. Several members of that group were convicted of unrelated crimes, and at least one investigator became convinced that one of them was the Phantom. But no charges were ever filed in connection with the 6 murders. The evidence never solidified into certainty, and still, he was not finished. September 5th, 1972, almost exactly 1 year after Nenemoshia Yates was killed, 17-year-old Diane Williams became the 6th and final known victim of the Freeway Phantom. She had been visiting her boyfriend and was on her way home when she vanished. Her body was found the following day. Same highway, same signature, same silence from the man who did it. And then, as if completing a thought, he stopped. No 7th victim was ever conclusively linked to the case. No arrest was ever made. The Freeway Phantom simply receded, back into whatever ordinary life he had been living between murders, back into the city, or perhaps out of it entirely. He went to work, or to church, or to his family's dinner table, and he carried what he had done somewhere inside himself, and the world never knew his name. Investigators over the decades have revisited the case repeatedly, in the 1980s and again in the 2000s. Cold case detectives re-examined evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and reanalyzed the note written in Brenda Woodard's hand. DNA technology that didn't exist in 1971 was applied to whatever biological evidence had survived storage. Profiles were built and rebuilt. Names were whispered in investigative circles. Suspects with knowledge of the area, access to vehicles, histories of violence. But the legal threshold of proof remained out of reach. What we are left with is this. Between April 1971 and September 1972, at least 6 girls and young women were murdered in Washington, D.C. Their bodies left along a stretch of highway like markers on a route only their killer understood. They were Carol, Darlenia, Brenda, Nenemoshia, Brenda, and Diane. They came from families who loved them, from a community that still remembers them, from a city that failed to protect them and failed to find justice for them. Somewhere, the Freeway Phantom lived out the rest of his life. And somewhere, 6 families lived out the rest of theirs without their daughters. The highway is still there. The case is still open. And the name he gave himself, written in a dead girl's handwriting, endures. The Villisca Axe Murders, 1912, USA. It's 7:00 in the morning on June 10th, 1912. A woman named Mary Peckham steps outside her home in Villisca, Iowa, a small, quiet farming town of about 2,500 people, and notices something immediately wrong about the house next door. The Moore residence is dead silent. No one has come out to do the morning chores. The chickens are still locked up. The curtains are drawn. Not a single light is on. Mary walks over and knocks on the door. Nothing. She tries the knob. Locked. Something in her gut tells her this isn't right, so she lets the Moore's chickens out herself and goes to find a telephone. She calls Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, and asks him to come check on the family. Ross arrives quickly. He knocks. He shouts. Still nothing. He pulls out his spare key, turns the lock, pushes open the door, and what he finds inside will haunt every single person in that town for the rest of their lives. Lying on the downstairs guest bed are two little girls, completely still, covered in blood. He bolts back out of the house, tells Mary to call the local peace officer immediately, and waits on the porch with his heart hammering in his chest. Because somewhere deep down, he already knows there's more. There's worse. Upstairs, Josiah B. Moore, everyone called him Joe, was 43 years old in the summer of 1912. He was a successful businessman, a respected member of the community, the kind of man who shook everyone's hand at church and remembered every name. He ran his own farm implement dealership. He was active in civic life, and by any measure of small-town America at the turn of the century, the Moores had made it. His wife Sarah, 39, was the backbone of the family, a warm, devoted woman who played piano for the church and had personally helped organize the Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian congregation. Together, they had 4 children: Herman, 11 years old, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, just 7, and little Paul Vernon, only 5. And then there were the Stillinger girls. Ina May Stillinger was 8 years old. Her older sister, Lena Gertrude, was 11. They lived on a large farm about 7 miles outside of town, and Ina was a close friend of Catherine Moore's. On the evening of Sunday, June 9, 1912, Catherine had invited both sisters to spend the night after church. It was supposed to be a joyful occasion. The whole family had attended a special evening Children's Day program at the newly built Presbyterian church, just a 5-minute walk from their home on 2nd Street. Sarah had helped coordinate the event. The kids performed. The congregation celebrated. And sometime around 9:30 or 10 that night, the Moore family walked home together under the summer sky, 2 little Stillinger girls in tow, and went to bed. That was the last time any of them were seen alive. When officers finally pushed open the door to the Moore house that morning of June 10th, they were met with a silence that felt unnatural, heavy, suffocating. The windows were covered. Every mirror in the house had been draped with cloth. Downstairs, they found the 2 Stillinger girls in the guest room, bludgeoned to death in their bed. Ina, the younger one, looked almost peaceful. She never woke up. But Lena's position told a different story. She had shifted in the bed. One arm was raised defensively. She had woken up, if only for a moment, in time to know what was coming, upstairs. And this is where it gets difficult to put into words. They found the rest. Joe and Sarah Moore in the master bedroom, both beaten beyond recognition. The ceiling above Joe's body had a deep gouge mark carved into the wood, left by the axe being raised above his head with enough force that the backswing caught the ceiling on the way up. Joe had received more blows than anyone else in the house. His face, according to the medical examiners, had been so savagely struck that his eyes were essentially destroyed. Then the children, Herman, Catherine, Arthur, and little 5-year-old Paul, each killed in their own beds. All of them bludgeoned about the head with the same axe. All of them while they slept. Doctors who examined the bodies estimated that the murders had taken place somewhere between midnight and 500 in the morning. The killer or killers had entered without breaking any windows, without forcing any locks. No valuables were taken. A bowl of bloody water sat in the downstairs washroom, as if someone had taken the time to clean up before leaving. 2 pieces of uncooked bacon were found lying on the floor, their origin and purpose never fully explained. And perhaps the strangest detail of all, investigators believed the killer had been inside the house before the family went to bed, hiding, waiting in the dark, possibly in the attic, until every last person in that house had fallen asleep. Just let that sink in for a second. 8 people under one roof, and somewhere in that house, in the quiet dark, someone was already waiting for them. News of the murders spread through Villisca like fire. By mid-morning on June 10th, hundreds of townspeople had descended on the Moore house. The scene was a disaster from an investigative standpoint. Well-meaning locals trampled through the rooms, touched surfaces, moved things, Any forensic evidence that might have existed was essentially destroyed before trained investigators even arrived. Bloodhounds were brought in to track a scent, but it was already too late. The trail, if there ever was one, was gone. The local authorities were almost immediately out of their depth. This was a town of 2,500 people. Nothing like this had ever happened here. Officials believed, and probably hoped, that whoever did this had fled with the 5-hour head start they'd had before the bodies were even discovered. But with no forced entry, no apparent motive, and 8 murdered victims, including 6 children, the pressure to find answers was enormous, and so began one of the longest, most tangled investigations in Iowa history. The first person whispered about in the days following the murders was a man named Frank F. Jones, a powerful Iowa state senator, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in all of Villisca. The connection to the Moores wasn't subtle. Years earlier, Joe Moore had worked for Jones in the farm implement business, and then after 7 years, Joe left, and when he went, he took a significant chunk of Jones's customer base with him to his own competing shop. By 1912, the two men despised each other, openly. The whole town knew it. So when 8 people turned up dead, and one of them was Joe Moore, a lot of people in Villisca didn't have to think very hard about where to point the finger. But here's the thing. Suspicion is not evidence. And while the accusations against Jones were loud enough to essentially destroy his political career, investigators could never build a real case against him. The rumors didn't go away, though. Some investigators believed Jones hadn't acted alone, that he may have hired someone to do it. A name started circulating. William Mansfield, a drifter, an ex-convict with a violent history. A private detective named James Wilkerson, hired by the victims' families, became convinced that Mansfield was Jones's hired killer. He pointed to similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe murders that had occurred in the region. But Mansfield produced payroll records showing he had been working several hundred miles away in Illinois at the time of the killings. He was released. Wilkerson, furious, publicly accused Jones of using his political influence to get Mansfield off the hook, and then he claimed Jones turned around and pushed investigators toward an entirely different suspect. That suspect was Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was a traveling preacher, born in England, who had settled in Macedonia, Iowa, in 1912 with his wife. He had come to Villisca specifically to assist with work at the Presbyterian Church, the same church where the Children's Day program was held on the night of June 9th. He was there. He attended the program. He saw the Moore family that night, the Stillinger girls, all of them together in that church. And then sometime in the very early hours of June 10th, before the bodies were even discovered, he left Villisca. Quietly, without a word to anyone. When investigators started looking at him years later, things got even more unsettling. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested and charged. During a lengthy interrogation, he confessed. He said he had gone back to the Moore house after the program. He said he had entered. He gave details about the crime scene that investigators argued. Only someone who had been inside could know. He described the killings with what one account called religious hysteria, framing the murders as some kind of divine act of purification. And then he recanted everything. He said the confession had been coerced, that he'd been pressured, manipulated, worn down by interrogators until he said what they wanted to hear. His case went to trial. The first jury couldn't reach a verdict, hung. The second jury acquitted him, and just like that, the most promising lead the investigation had ever produced walked out of a courtroom a free man. Meanwhile, a parade of other suspects moved through the investigation. There was Andy Sawyer, a transient worker who had shown up in Creston, Iowa, on the very morning the murders were discovered, clean-shaven, wearing a brown suit. He told his foreman he had been in Villisca the night before, but had left because he was afraid he might be considered a suspect. His co-workers noticed he was obsessively reading newspaper coverage of the Villisca murders. He slept fully dressed. He kept an axe beside him at night. And then, in one of the more chilling moments of the entire investigation, A foreman walked up behind Sawyer one day without being heard, and Sawyer suddenly jumped up, swung his axe at a pile of timber, and shouted, "I will cut your goddamn heads off." On another occasion, driving through Villisca with a colleague, Sawyer allegedly pointed to a specific location near the Moore house and said he could show where the killer had escaped, jumping over a manure box and crossing the railroad tracks. That's not normal behavior. And yet, Sawyer had an alibi. Records showed he had been arrested for vagrancy in Osceola, Iowa, on the night of the murders, and a sheriff there remembered putting him on a train at 11 p.m. Technically, given travel times, it's not impossible he could have made it to Villisca before the killings. But it was thin enough that investigators couldn't push it further, and Sawyer was released. Then there was Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, who, just a few months after the Villisca massacre, murdered his own mother and grandmother with an axe in a separate case. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. A federal investigator named McClaughry became convinced that Henry Moore was a traveling axe murderer, responsible not just for Villisca, but for a series of similar killings across the Midwest, a string of crimes that some historians believe may have claimed as many as 22 lives across multiple states. McClaughry built a compelling theory, noting the pattern of victims killed in their beds, the use of an axe, covered windows, and other repeated signatures. But compelling theories without hard evidence don't hold up in court. Henry Moore was never charged with Villisca. He served 36 years of his life sentence and was paroled in 1949. He died without ever being connected to the case in any official capacity. 113 years have passed since that Sunday night in June 1912. The house on 2nd Street still stands. In the 1990s, it was restored and opened as a museum. People pay to spend the night there, chasing whatever restless energy still lingers in those rooms. The gouge mark left by the axe in the ceiling of the master bedroom is still visible. The case itself remains officially unsolved. No conviction, no definitive answer, not even, truly, a single dominant theory that holds up cleanly under scrutiny. Frank Jones had motive but no confirmed link. Reverend Kelly confessed and then walked free. Henry Lee Moore fit a pattern but was never charged. William Mansfield had a shaky alibi and a violent history. Andy Sawyer knew things he shouldn't have known and then turned out probably not to have done it. 8 people, 6 of them children, killed in their sleep in a house on a quiet street in a small Iowa town, on a warm summer night after a church program, after laughter and music, and a family walking home together under the stars. And whoever walked into that house and waited in the dark for them to fall asleep, whoever raised that axe 8 times, has never been named. Not officially. Not conclusively. Not in a way that has ever fully satisfied the people of Villisca, or the families of the dead, or the thousands of investigators and amateur sleuths and historians who have pored over this case in the centuries since. Some questions, it turns out, don't have answers. Some doors, once opened, stay open forever.